Today is March 2nd, 2021, and I was just thinking to myself earlier today about what all was happening exactly a year ago from today in the first week of March 2020. Now, this was right before COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. The WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic on March 11th, 2020. But just the week before that, in the first week of March 2020, even just the week before COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, most of us at least did not have any idea of how bad COVID-19 would become. We didn't even have any idea that all these social distancing measures would have to be put into place. We didn't have any idea that all these lockdown measures would be put into place. We had no idea how much the number of cases and the number of deaths due to COVID-19 would spiral out of control. Just over a year ago from today, on March 1st, 2020, that was the day when we hit 20 COVID-19 cases in the United States. And February 29th, 2020, the day before that's when we had the first recorded death due to COVID-19 in the United States. So back then, even in the first week of March 2020, the number of cases and number of deaths due to COVID-19 was very small. But then throughout the next few weeks in March 2020, that completely spiraled out of control. We went from just one COVID-19 death and 20 COVID-19 cases to over 1.5 million cases and 100,000 deaths due to COVID-19 just by the end of May 2020. So just throughout the spring of 2020, the number of COVID-19 cases and the number of COVID-19 deaths completely skyrocketed. And just as late as the first week of March 2020, we still had no idea how bad things would become. We had no idea about all the different measures that would be put into place in order to curb the spread of COVID-19. We had no idea how many people would catch this virus, how many people would die from this virus. We had no idea how much this virus would spread and how much our lives would change as a result of this virus. My point is that even as late as the first week of March 2020, nobody was thinking about this virus, but by the end of March, that was all anybody could think about because of how much this virus had changed our lives. Now getting to the main point of this video, what most of us were thinking about in terms of politics in the first week of 2020 was the 2020 Democratic Primaries. Back in early March 2020, it was still not clear who would become the Democratic nominee for the 2020 presidential election. At that point, it was mainly between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. They were the two candidates with the best chance of winning the 2020 Democratic primaries. You see, on February 22nd, 2020, that's when Bernie Sanders won the Nevada caucus by a landslide. He absolutely obliterated everybody else in the Nevada caucus. He had also, earlier in that month, in February of 2020, he had also won the New Hampshire primary, and he had also just barely lost to Pete Buttigieg in the Iowa caucus. In the Iowa caucus, that was February 3rd, 2020, it was very, very close between Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders. Pete Buttigieg barely came out on top. It was a very, very close race in Iowa. But my point is that Bernie Sanders was doing very well up until the Nevada caucus. But then a week later, on February 29th, 2020, Leap Day 2020, that's when Joe Biden was able to make his comeback. In that last week of February, between the Nevada caucus and the South Carolina primary, it looked like Bernie Sanders had a very good chance of winning the entire 2020 Democratic primaries. He had won 2 of the 3 primaries. He had won the popular vote in all 3 of the first 3 primaries. In the Iowa caucus, he got more votes, but because of the way that the delegate system works in the state of Iowa, Pete Buttigieg was able to barely come out on top in terms of delegates, but Bernie Sanders did get more votes in Iowa, so he had gotten the most votes in all 3 of the first 3 primaries. So it looked like in the last week of February, between February 22nd and 29th, that Bernie Sanders had a really good chance of just running away with everything and winning the 2020 Democratic primaries. But in that last week of February, Joe Biden worked pretty hard in the state of South Carolina in order to not only win that state, but also win with a giant margin. He was able to win almost half of the votes in the state of South Carolina. Throughout February 2020, that's also when Michael Bloomberg started to really surge in the polls. He announced his candidacy for the 2020 Democratic primaries pretty late in November of 2019, which is generally a pretty late date for a candidate to announce their run for the presidency. But despite that, because of how much money Michael Bloomberg has, he is a multi-billionaire after all. He was able to buy a lot of advertisements, I mean a lot. The amount of money that Michael Bloomberg spent on campaign advertisements does not even compare to the amount that any other candidate spent. He had so much money on hand that he was able to spend on advertisements that for a while it looked like Michael Bloomberg actually had a decent shot at winning the 2020 Democratic primaries just because of how much money he had. Tom Steyer was also another candidate with a lot of money on hand. He was also a billionaire that was running in the 2020 Democratic primaries, but he did not have nearly as much money as Michael Bloomberg. So basically, what Tom Steyer tried to do but failed, Michael Bloomberg was actually able to do with a good amount of success. Tom Steyer's goal, I think, was to try to win the 2020 Democratic primaries using his money, since he was one of the only billionaires running, but he had not nearly as much money as Michael Bloomberg did, so Michael Bloomberg was able to vastly outspend Tom Steyer in the 2020 Democratic primaries. And once Tom Steyer realized he had no shot of winning the 2020 Democratic primaries during the South Carolina primary on February 29th, 2020, he dropped out that night. So Michael Bloomberg at that point was the only billionaire left in the race. There is one advantage, though, that Tom Steyer had over Michael Bloomberg, and it's that Michael Bloomberg decided that he would just entirely skip the first four primaries and he would just start actually trying to win the primaries on Super Tuesday, which was March 3rd, 2020, meaning he didn't campaign in Iowa, he didn't campaign in New Hampshire or Nevada or even South Carolina. He only spent advertisements in the Super Tuesday states, which at first looked like a good strategy for him, but in hindsight, that was a pretty bad move for him. And I'm going to talk about why that was a pretty bad move for Bloomberg in a second. But my point is that because Michael Bloomberg didn't run in the first four states, that was Tom Steyer's chance to spend as much money as possible to try to make a name for himself by doing as well as possible in the first four primaries. And it did not go very well for Tom Steyer. I believe that South Carolina was the state in which he performed the best in out of the first four states, and even in South Carolina, where he didn't have to worry about Michael Bloomberg and he was able to easily outspend his opponents, he only got 11.34% of the votes in that state, which is honestly more than I expected, but that's still a pretty small amount of votes to receive. And as a result of that, Tom Steyer dropped out of the 2020 Democratic primaries on February 29th, 2020, the night of the South Carolina primary. He realized that night that he had absolutely no chance at winning the 2020 Democratic primaries because that was the last primary, the South Carolina primary, that was the last primary where Michael Bloomberg wasn't campaigning. But on Super Tuesday, Michael Bloomberg spent a lot of advertisements in all those states. So Tom Steyer realized that he had no chance of winning because there was another billionaire also running for the presidency that had way more money than him, and he knew that Michael Bloomberg could vastly outspend him in all of the remaining states. So Tom Steyer decided then to drop out of the 2020 presidential primaries, but that was after he had already spent a lot of money. He spent, I believe, over $200 million for his 2020 presidential run, or around that much money. So he spent a lot of money, but did not get very far at all because his best performance was in South Carolina, but even then he only got around 11% of the votes there. So in South Carolina, Joe Biden got first, Bernie Sanders got second, Tom Steyer got third, but Pete Buttigieg only got fourth. See, Pete Buttigieg had a good performance early on. He got first place in Iowa by a very small margin, and he got second place in New Hampshire, but almost won New Hampshire. And then in Nevada, he didn't do nearly as well, and in South Carolina, he also didn't do that well. And I guess Pete Buttigieg also realized that he didn't have a good chance of winning the 2020 presidential primaries because the day after the South Carolina primary, on March 1st, 2020, that's the day that Pete Buttigieg dropped out, and shortly after Pete Buttigieg dropped out, he endorsed Joe Biden in the 2020 Democratic primaries. What's important to understand is that the South Carolina primary was on February 29th, but the Super Tuesday primaries were just 3 days later on March 3rd, 2020. So between South Carolina and Super Tuesday, I'm guessing that all the different candidates had to analyze their performances in the first four primaries and from there decide whether or not they had a good shot of winning the 2020 Democratic primaries. And I guess Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar realized that they did not have a good chance of winning the primaries because the day after Pete Buttigieg dropped out on March 1st, on March 2nd, 2020, Amy Klobuchar also dropped out of the 2020 Democratic primaries, and she, just like Pete Buttigieg, endorsed Joe Biden. Now, I'm going to talk about why this is important now. You see, on the night of March 2nd, 2020, just the day before Super Tuesday, Joe Biden held a rally. This was shortly after Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar had endorsed him. And the reason why he held a rally in Texas was because Texas was one of the states that had a primary on Super Tuesday, and it had a lot of delegates that were to be won. So Joe Biden had this rally in order to get himself more support. And not only did Joe Biden appear at this rally, but also Pete Buttigieg appeared, Amy Klobuchar appeared, and even Beto O'Rourke was also at this rally, the person who narrowly lost to Ted Cruz in the 2018 Senate election in Texas, and also a candidate that had previously run for president but dropped out in November of 2019. It turns out that Beto O'Rourke, right before Tuesday, also endorsed Joe Biden for the 2020 Democratic primaries. And the reason why this matters so much is because a lot of the supporters of Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, their support went straight to Joe Biden. The thing about Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar and Joe Biden is that they were more moderate candidates, but Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they were two candidates that were further left. So the moderate vote wasn't split as much because a lot more of the moderate vote was going to Joe Biden now, because Pete Buttigieg was no longer there, Amy Klobuchar was no longer there, and because of their endorsements, a lot of their supporters now voted for Joe Biden. And this had a pretty noticeable impact during Super Tuesday because Joe Biden was able to win a lot of the states on this day. Now, I'm making this video today because today is actually exactly a year after that rally, that Joe Biden rally took place in Dallas, and that's actually the picture that I have on screen. It's a picture of that rally that took place exactly a year ago in Dallas, Texas. And this, I think, is what really changed up the dynamics of the 2020 presidential primaries, the Democratic primaries, because that's what made it so that Joe Biden had a much better chance of winning because a lot more of the moderate support went straight to Joe Biden instead of being split up between Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar. And like I said, the impact was pretty noticeable on Super Tuesday. Now, the day after Super Tuesday, Michael Bloomberg actually dropped out. Michael Bloomberg was the only other major candidate still running besides Joe Biden, but the day after Super Tuesday, he dropped out of the presidential primaries. What's important to understand is that Michael Bloomberg actually did not do very well in Super Tuesday. He actually only won one of the primaries, and he did not get a lot of delegates from that win. I believe it was American Samoa where he won, and Tulsi Gabbard, who is from American Samoa, got second place. It sort of looks like to me that the endorsements of Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg screwed over Michael Bloomberg just as much as they screwed over Bernie Sanders because Michael Bloomberg did not get a lot of votes in the Super Tuesday primaries because a lot of the moderate votes went straight to Joe Biden, and that's why Joe Biden was able to easily win a lot of these states. Michael Bloomberg, I think, should have started actually campaigning in the South Carolina primary. I think Michael Bloomberg could have done decently in that. I think Michael Bloomberg waited way too long to start campaigning to the point where even with all the money that he spent, it wasn't enough to get him very far in the primaries. And by the time he dropped out, he had already spent a lot of money on the 2020 Democratic primaries, definitely more than even Steyer, who had already spent $200 million. I believe Bloomberg spent $500 million with a B. And then the day after Michael Bloomberg dropped out on March 4th, Elizabeth Warren dropped out of the 2020 Democratic primaries on March 5th, 2020. So at this point, there were only two major candidates left in the running, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Joe Biden represented the more moderate wing of the Democratic primary, while Bernie Sanders represented the more left wing of the party. There was also Tulsi Gabbard running still, but she had literally no shot at winning the 2020 Democratic primaries. It was down to Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders was not able to adjust with the changing dynamics of the 2020 Democratic primaries, and he wasn't able to adjust to there only being two candidates left, him and Joe Biden. His plan, I think, was to originally have Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar split the moderate votes so that Bernie Sanders could win with around 30% of the votes in most of these primaries. But after Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropped out, it was a lot harder for him to win this way because now he had to get 50% of the votes since there was only one other major candidate left. And he was not able to adjust in time, and as a result, Joe Biden was able to easily win on Super Tuesday 2, which was March 10th, 2020, where Joe Biden won 5 of the 6 primaries. So right after Super Tuesday 2 finished up on March 10th, 2020, that's when we all started worrying about COVID-19. March 11th, 2020, the day after Super Tuesday 2 is when it was declared a pandemic. So at that point, we mostly forgot about the primaries, and it was pretty obvious at that point that Joe Biden would be the nominee for the Democratic primaries. It's crazy to think about, though, how quickly things shifted from the Democratic primaries to COVID-19. It's also crazy to think about how much has happened in the past year ever since the 2020 Democratic primaries took place in February and March of 2020.